We're delighted to welcome Hayley and Dan from Center Screen. Really excited about a collaboration the like of which we dream of. So this is a great day of celebration. I also want to acknowledge that it is critically important for us to identify opportunities to tell you about how the bar has been raised. And I think in the Olympic and Paralympic Museum, which has just opened in Colorado, this is one of those raise the bar moments. And I think it's particularly apt that this is the Olympic and Paralympic Museum. We were deeply invested in the 2012 Olympics in London that really, for the first time, established parity between the Olympics and the Paralympics, changed the world in our estimation. And this is an opportunity to celebrate that same phenomenon of parity between the Olympics and the Paralympics. But you folks have brought it to a whole new art. And I think it's a critically important story to share with as many people as possible. We also would like to announce very generally, it hasn't been announced formally yet, so I can only say that this project has won a grand award for an international design competition. And we hope that that will elevate and inform the work that you're doing and make it much more pervasively just the way we do things. I would like to introduce Jan Majewski, our director of Inclusive Cultural Projects, who has been the collaborator along with some of our other team with Jan and with Dan and Hayley over the last 3 years. And Jan is very tired of being the person who has to be the critic. She loves being the person who is the collaborator. So she's terribly excited about this. So Jan, take it away.
Thank you, Valerie. Hi, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. To second Valerie's praise of Hayley and Dan and the whole team, IHCD has been working on the USOPM project for more than 3 years. And while many contractors will lightly say that it's a pleasure to work with their clients, it truly was a pleasure to work with these two folks that we have as speakers today and the rest of the team from Center Screen and Gallagher and Associates. And from someone who has been working in this field for a very long time, it was also a rich learning experience every time we met. As Center Screen's website states, we work in collaboration with our clients, and they really do. Just a little background on Center Screen, and I don't want to preempt anything that Hayley and Dan will say, but they are from the UK, have been working since 1986, and Center Screen has produced audiovisual media for clients, including national museums and historic sites around the world. Hayley Walsh is Center Screen's project and company director. Hayley's interest in inclusive and engaging storytelling through the use of media and interactivity has seen her role develop through the content research and production to delivery of large-scale complex multimedia and interactive software contracts for museum and visitors attractions worldwide. She is very often involved in Center Screen's projects from initial consultancy to concept design through production and final installation. Dan Cooper is Center Screen's head of interactive. Dan has about 20 years of experience leading exciting digital projects for screens and audiences of all shapes and sizes. His work has been based largely around broadcasting, brands, and visitor experiences, and usually has education at its heart. As head of interactive at Center Screen, he is currently helping museums and visitor attractions use innovative technology to tell compelling stories, accessible to all. He leads a small team working on a variety of projects, both in-house and in collaboration with partners. Dan enjoys the challenge of connecting the dots between ambition, user needs, data, research, and testing. Dan and Hayley, thank you so much for being here, and I turn it over to you.
Lovely. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for that very warm welcome and introduction, Valerie and Jan. First of all, I'd just like to say it's an absolute privileged to be asked to come in and share our project journey with you all. I think if it weren't for the fact that the inclusive design and accessibility community hadn't shared their knowledge and findings from projects that went before this one, we wouldn't have had the leg up that we had at the start of the project, with all of that knowledge that was already out there and the testing that had already been done. So we feel we owe it to bring something back to the community and share what we found on the project, and hopefully continue the collaboration into the future to keep raising that bar, as Valerie and Jan have just mentioned. So yes, thank you for having us. So I will get right into it and just give a quick introduction to the project. I'm sure the museum has been great at getting pictures and captures online, so that there's plenty on there in terms of gallery views and having a look at what the museum has to offer. But generally, just to set the scene of the museum, it's in Colorado Springs, a purpose-built building, and we have a brief video just showing its location within the surrounding environment, just to give you an idea and a location context. So we can play that now, and it's let's just say, here we go. Okay, so that just gives you an overview of where it's situated. It's overlooked by Pikes Peak, and there's a great surrounding in terms of accessibility to the actual site, and the architecture of the building too. And I think before we go into the project and where it was when we came to it, we thought it'd be good to just talk a little bit about some of the developments that had already taken place in terms of project progress and progress across the aspects of parity across the Olympic and Paralympic committees. So as everybody probably knows, the Olympic Committee, the US Olympic Committee, is based in Colorado Springs, and in 2019, just after us joining this project, they actually became the US Olympic and Paralympic Committee. And I think this quotation here on screen says it all, really, that it was such a proud day for all involved, and it was such a great boost to the project and what everybody was working on at that time. And those changes were also rolled out across the training centre and the Hall of Fame, which is situated in the lobby of the museum. And I think this quote here from Paralympian Oksana Masters really, I think, set the tone and the spirit for the project for us in terms of content parity and how we wanted to approach it in terms of attitude and enthusiasm. And it was about the change being more than an organisational name. It was that full inclusivity of Paralympic athletes, Paralympians being fully included, embraced and celebrated by the Olympic and Paralympic Committee. So yeah, good one, a good event to mention there, just to set the tone of the project. So then, yeah, on the next slide. So in terms of moving on from there, I think coming to the project, obviously there was already a very well-established project team in place of various partners, which I'll come on to in a moment, just to give everyone an overview. But I think what was immediately apparent to us when we came to the project, above and all else, was this shared ambition the shared ambition to achieve this parity and inclusivity through the adoption or the acknowledgement and adoption of Olympic and Paralympic values. And I think for us, it was really just great to immerse ourselves in those values and really think about how they could be applied to the storytelling and our technical and creative approaches to each of the digital content briefs that we were presented with at the outset of our involvement in the project. And I think looking at the Paralympic movement and how it uses the movement as a vehicle for wider disability rights and social inclusion really was an inspiration, I think, for all across the project. This idea of creating experiences that are meaningful for everybody. This idea of taking existing knowledge and expertise and really seeing where you can go with it and standing on the shoulders, I guess, of those who have speaking cliches, but trodden that path before you, really. And I think for us, that again was important to really setting the tone and the ambition of how we wanted to approach the project, that shared ambition of inclusivity and innovation, and really using already existing knowledge to in the best way that we could and doing it justice. So moving on, I think, to the next slide, just a little bit about Centre Screen, and Jan gave us a very kind introduction, so I won't go on too much, but just to explain, we do work predominantly on museum leisure heritage projects on a variety of subject matters and briefs and formats. I think essentially, if I were to summarise it, if it goes on screen, we'll produce it. And something we really love to do. We love getting into the client's story, really getting at the heart of the client's key messages and the stories that they want to tell. And it's probably worth mentioning that the US Olympic and Paralympic Museum belongs to a network of Olympic museums. A flagship museum being with the IOC in Lausanne, Switzerland, and that was the first Olympic project that Centre Screen were involved with, and from that point we've been fortunate enough to be involved in a number of worldwide Olympic museums. And I think what was really unique for us with this project and really took it to another level for us was that parity of Olympism and Paralympism within the overall digital content brief. And for us, was just an absolute delight to get involved with, because it was the first time that we had that opportunity to really tell those stories together within the same context of the same museum in equal measure with parity. So that's a little bit of background on how we've been involved with the network of museums. So when we came to the project, as I mentioned just earlier, there was a project team already in place, and they've done a lot of work in, obviously there was the architecture of the building by DSNR, the architects, exhibition designers, Gallagher and Associates, the strategic museum consultant, Gallagher Museum Services, the fabricators, custom fabricators, Creo Exhibit, the content partners, Barry Projects, and the hardware engineers, BBI, and Stark RFID. And we also collaborated with Kiss the Frog, based in the Netherlands, on the software development, so that they worked in partnership with us. So a very established team already by the time that we came to the project, and we'll talk a little bit more about how we worked with those project partners as we move through the presentation. So if we move on to the next slide, what we can see here, just as to give an example of the amount of work that had already been done before we came to the project. This is a slide. In fact, we could probably possibly go to the next one, illustrates the point a bit more. Gallagher and Associates, in terms of their gallery design, this is an early accessibility enhancement plan that they've been working on before our involvement. So when we came to the project, obviously we were lucky enough to have this head start and look at what had already been done and discussed, and what the ambitions were from gallery to gallery, and really look at that visitor journey. And from there, start to look at, in terms of the digital exhibits, the interactives and the linear films, what the content would be, and from there work out what the experience should be, and really design the most inclusive experience that we could from scratch. And so one of the major considerations, a wonderful tool to be handed the opportunity to work with at the start of the project, was the implementation of RFID, and that was Stark RFID, who were working on the installation of that hardware, and really looking at, as part of this early digital design process, how we might best use that RFID system to design and deliver the most inclusive experience that we could. So I'll hand over to Dan to talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Hayley. Just before I begin, I'm actually just going to stop screen sharing just for 10 seconds and just refresh the presentation deck. I think some of the slides were slightly out of date there, so just bear with me 10 seconds and apologies for that. Just to make sure we've got the latest slides in the right order. Okay, so if I share screen again. There we go. Okay, apologies for that. So yeah, as Hayley articulated there, we sort of joined the projects at the perfect stage, really. As we were sort of going through the tender process, we were aware of, I guess, sort of the kit of parts available and the overall ambition. There was this obviously great, admirable ambition of the museum to reach this gold standard of accessibility and inclusivity. And there were a number of things in place at that stage on the project, but thankfully, really, from our point of view, not everything was necessarily set in stone at that stage. So, for example, you know, we knew the overall scope of the project in terms of the list of individual exhibits, but a lot of those exhibits were still at a stage where they could be shaped in terms of the full detail of exactly what the visitor experience would be, which is fantastic. Sometimes we pick up projects that are exactly like that. Sometimes we pick up projects that are one or the other end of that spectrum, really. So, for example, sometimes a project is pretty much set in stone to start with, and sometimes we've got a completely blank canvas. This fell somewhere between the two, so it meant at sort of the stage of sort of opening the conversation, we were able to really kind of work with things like the storyboards here, so we could start to conceptualize and create a vision piece around what the visitor journey might be, how we could help visitors in the end-to-end sense, from their first recognition of the museum to purchasing a ticket, arriving on the day, going through and enjoying all those exhibits throughout the museum, and then continuing that journey beyond the sort of the day of the visit there as well. So it's perfect time for us to get involved, really, and it had allowed us then to look at this idea of using the RFID really as a tool to allow visitors to be able to sort of to seamlessly enjoy all of the experiences. So on the next slide, we start to sort of talk through, I guess, how we sort of turned that into an overall strategy to begin with, and that's kind of where we're going to sort of take you to in terms of this first part of the presentation today. We'll then pause for questions, and then after that point, we'll sort of drill down into the exhibit by exhibit detail. But we thought it was useful, really, just to start with that overview in terms of what that overall strategy was. We kind of looked at this in sort of two levels. There was the sort of that macro level of the overall museum and how we might use this set of tools to create sort of a holistic visitor journey overall, and then drill that down in terms of setting the broad ambition and looking at on an instance by instance basis. When we're going through the museum, there are almost no two screens that are the same in terms of shape and size and height and all kinds of combination of factors there, as well as the actual desired visitor experience. Some of these things are very physical. We'll go through those in a bit more detail later. Some are more traditional, some are linear, some are interactive. So there's lots of different things for us to take into account. Our starting point, really, this was kind of the first conversations we had with the museum team and the broader team, was really to ensure that that idea of inclusive design was our starting point for everything. So we were able to then to shape everything with that in mind, from the basics of the screen design to the more, I guess, the more sort of ambitious areas. So how do we script things? How do we arrange shoots? How do we make sure that everything that we're piecing together throughout that sort of 2 to 3 year lifespan of the project is all geared towards that final piece being as inclusive and as accessible as possible? So that was very much our starting point, and there are a few key decisions that were made at that stage which really helped to enable us from there onwards. So, for example, we talked very early on to the museum team about the idea of looking at best practice across the industry, looking at various other museums, places like the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. What are the kind of things that they're doing that are being really well received, that are making visitors feel included, feeling part of that journey? And so there were things that we felt were fairly easy wins, for example, including captions and American Sign Language baked into all screen design, so that whether it's an immersive sort of 270-degree experience where you sort of enter in a room and everything's happening around you, where will the ASL, where will the captions sit within that experience? Likewise, if it's a more straightforward 16:9 video presentation, we kind of wanted to gain that consistency from the offset and make sure that as visitors walked around, it was clear actually this is a museum for everybody. Secondly, we knew as well that there would be certain services and elements that might start to jar for visitors if we tried to throw everything at everybody. So things like the screen reader, things like audio descriptions, obviously they're the kind of services that it makes much more sense to trigger in real time for visitors who need them. So we have an RFID tag. The image to the right of the screen here is sort of an early design for that tag that visitors are presented with when they arrive in the museum. Of course, the RFID, that's the enabling technology. From a visitor experience point of view, it's not a word that's discussed with the visitors really on site. All they know is that they receive this tag, they go to a registration area, and in that registration area, they're able to start to give some details over to the museum that helps to enable and personalise that experience for them. So we've got a couple of slides here. Firstly, we've got a slide that starts to show some of the early screen designs of that registration process. And then secondly, we're going to go into a video where we actually see an on-site tour with Alsam from Creo Exhibits. They were the fabricators for the project, along with Chris Liddell, who's the chief exec for the museum, and Hunter Kemper and Mike Talipietra from Team USA are part of that walkthrough as well. Just before we go into that, I thought it would just be useful because in the walkthrough we don't necessarily see a sort of a super close-up on the screens during the registration. So I thought I'd take it back a step or two and just show some of the initial screen design. And all of this screen design was iterated on throughout the process, and I think in all cases small changes were made, but I'll sort of just describe each of them one at a time. So the process starts with the basic personal information, some of which is marketing information and some of which is about sort of personalizing that journey for visitors. So we ask visitors for their first name and surname. We also ask them for the zip code. All those elements we've been able to weave into the visitor journey throughout the museum as well. So for example, in one of the galleries there's a huge 9-screen interactive wall. On that wall there's a big map of the US, and we use that zip code data to help to personalize that experience, to pinpoint, here you are, here's your location, here are some athletes who may be a little bit like you, they may have had some similarities to you in terms of their upbringing, in terms of the area, here's their journey to success. So we're able to use all the data that we gather here in a way that helps personalize that experience. We also ask visitors to identify a summer Olympic sport and a winter Olympic sport that's not necessarily their favourite sport, but a sport that they like, and we use that again to help to curate and make sort of suggestions, recommendations around the museum. None of that restricts visitors from being able to see everything. Everything's always available for everybody, but helps to signpost things. So, for example, here we've got the pictogram on screen, top left there, for tennis. And so we know that if visitors like tennis, then they may also like other similar sports, table tennis, maybe other sports with balls as well. You know, things like that. We can start to sort of tailor a bit more of a personal experience. So the first part of registration enables people to enter that data, and they're presented with an avatar, which is shown in that top left screen there. So it's there are a few things that are randomized within the system, and a few things based on their choices and their input. So the LB, for example, that's representative of first name and surname, and the pictogram on screen is representative of one of the sports that they've told us that they like. The colors randomized, the shapes randomized, and it means that as people move from screen to screen, then there's a sense of identity on those screens when they're welcomed automatically by the distant RFID. The tag that we saw on the previous slide works at range, so visitors aren't having to walk to a screen and to tap to register. This is very much sort of a distant experience. So that's the start of the registration process, and as visualized here, there are other elements to choose there, things like text size. It's very much sort of created as a WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get interface, that allows people to see, you know, if I change this text size from standard to large to largest, what is the tangible difference on the screen in front of me? Likewise, things like audio descriptions, we give people a sample so they get a sense of what an audio description is. The same with the screen reader as well. And where possible, we change those settings in real time for the visitor. So here, for example, you can on the bottom right-hand screen, that is an example of the high contrast setting being selected. So we lose the blue facets in the background there, design-wise, and replace those with solid black. You know, knowing that that is the highest contrast between the text and the background there. And that will then be a feature that follows the visitors around from screen to screen. We see the RFID registration process as being the start of a digital fingerprint that visitors use throughout the museum journey. At any screen throughout the museum, they can then, if it's a touch screen, they can go back into to menu settings and change and adjust those settings if they wish to. But these are kind of the settings up front. And as I say, these screen designs are slightly earlier versions. So for example, things like the closed captions and the sign language interpretation, we removed the option for visitors to switch those on and off. We felt that everything had been designed in such a way that those elements sat really comfortably within the mix, and there wasn't necessarily a visitor need to turn those things on and off. So that's a bit of background on the registration process. We're going to go into a video here, which is a walkthrough of the area. It's the lobby area in the museum. The first voice that you hear will be Al Sam from Creo, fabricators for the project. He's working directly with Hunter Kemper and Mike Talley-Petra from Team USA to show this sort of initial registration experience.
At the registration, that's where it allows you to personalize your journey. As Chris described, picking your favorite sport, allowing you to identify any accessibility access that you'd want, such as audio description, change the contrast of the screen, as well as increase the size of the text. All things that might help the visitor keep an equal experience. The badges we have on that Hunter is showing you right now is what you use. It's got an RFID chip, long-range RFID, built into it that then allows you to carry that identity throughout. One of the other things that the RFID does is it allows you to personalize your journey and allows you to start your digital locker. The digital locker is basically a storage place where when you choose things from the Hall of Fame or through various activities you do through the museum, it's a way to reach that same content remotely once you're outside of the museum.
I get to bookmark my favorite sport. Is that right, Al?
That's right. Bookmark your favorite sport.
I'm going to pick triathlon.
That's a good idea.
Okay, so that's the end of sort of the initial scene setting part of the presentation. So I think we're going to hand over to Jan next to go through the first sort of section of Q&A before we go into a bit more detail on the individual exhibits.
Thank you so much, Dan and Hayley. And if I can start out by apologizing, we've had a technical problem and we've lost our captioner. We are trying very hard to find out what happened to the captioner and get that back online very quickly. Just as a bit of information, Dan and Hayley's and the rest of the USOPM's team, this wonderful project is described in a book that we have now up on IHCD's website. It's called Inclusive Digital Interactives. It's a book that belongs to Access Smithsonian, and it was a collaboration between Access Smithsonian, the IHCD, and Muse Web. And chapter number 2 describes this wonderful project and 15 other projects. So you can read all 407 pages online on either our site, and Anupa will put in the link in the chat, or on Access Smithsonian's webpage under Resources for Museum Professionals. It's an accessible PDF format for reading online or downloading. Okay, we've got a bunch of wonderful questions coming in. From Helen Divick, how does the registration process and avatars work for users who are blind and visually impaired?
So the registration process, everything's screen readable as a starting point. So at the point of sale, when visitors first receive their RFID credential on site, visitors are advised as to where the registration desks are, and also advised that there are universal keypads as well, which can help for some visitors who require those to navigate the interface. For those who use the universal keypad, the screen reader functionality automatically kicks in and triggers straight away, so that everything is sort of read as they go through. And for those who use the touchscreen, the ability to turn on that screen reader is one of the first questions within that process. In terms of the avatar, of course, there are certain elements there that are naturally visual in terms of things like the shape and the colour that sort of identify the visitor screen by screen. But what happens is, as a visitor approaches a screen, they will be welcomed by name on most screens throughout the museum, certainly any interactive screens. So as they arrive at the screen from distance as well, they don't have to touch the screen to enable that facility. So visitors who have selected that the service there to have the screen reader available will be welcomed by name as they approach. So that kind of gives that equivalence of how do I know if I've been recognised by the screen? Well, with the screen reader, your name's called out to you, or if you're using the icon, then obviously that sort of differentiates you from the person stood next to you at the next screen.
We also have the probably worth mentioning, the audio description playing out at the start of the entrance, or the transitional area into each gallery, which gives you a full description of the layout, objects and key points with which to interact or listen. So that interpretation is offered at those entry points throughout as well.
Okay, to go to more of an overview question, Betty Siegel from the Kennedy Center asks, who drove the focus on making the exhibit accessible, the designers or the venue?
That's a tough one, because I honestly, believe me when I say, I think everybody was so on board with achieving that aim, that it was really a question. And I would say that sometimes the role shifted within those group sessions and user testing sessions and the review and progress meetings. There would always be somebody in the room who would bring it back to that focus. And I think I would say really that the designers were so on board with the brief to achieve that, and that ambition from the museum never waned throughout the entirety of the project. And so I'd honestly say, hand on heart, it came from both the museum and the designers from the outset to completion.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say as well that obviously the museum team set out with that initial ambition. This is the grand statement of where they want to get to, which is great. And our project partners signed up to that ambition. And I'm sure many people like ourselves were keen to get involved in the project because of that ambition. And so I think from there it created effectively a chain of accountability, really, whereby everybody was bought into that vision. Everybody wanted to deliver to that vision. And we were able to ask questions of one another throughout the process. So there were times where the museum team would ask questions of ourselves. There were times when we'd ask questions of the exhibition designers and the fabricators and so on and so forth, so that it created a nice atmosphere, really, where everybody's asking questions of one another, including when we're working with people like Jan and Anupa and the team. That everybody's always questioning one another throughout the process. And likewise, when we then sit down to do user testing, which we'll go on to talk about in the next session, or now that the museum's open as well, the people that we're doing the user testing with and the visitors are ultimately all stakeholders in this process as well. So that sort of chain of accountability sort of comes right down to the end user, and we like nothing more really than sort of being asked those questions as we kind of going through development. Have you thought about this? How are we delivering that? And I think it's by having that sort of collaborative approach, everybody bought into the shared strategic vision, that we kind of get to the end result. I think as the AV software producers, a lot of the time we, I guess, become it's almost like we're sort of driving the bus that everyone's kind of on board with, and a lot of that then comes back down to us because our software sits at that point that joins the visitor experience to the hardware, to the exhibition design, to the fabrication. So it's quite a nice position for us to be in, to kind of make sure that we're focused on this, we're championing this, and we'll make sure that everybody is continuing on that journey with us.
Okay, we'll take one more question about the RFID program before we move on to the second half, where you'll answer a lot of the other questions that have come up. There are questions about designing for people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And one person asked, you mentioned removing ASL and captioning from initial registration settings. Do those default to on for all visitors?
Yes.
I'm sorry,
in a word. But yes, and I think the that was very early on an approach with which it was an absolute delight to work with, because I think for Centre Screen it presented the opportunity for us to design with ASL and captions as part of the aesthetic, as part of the design, which we'll talk about a bit more later on in the presentation. But really think about, these are going to be, particularly with the linear AV, where we have the films on loop, so we don't have that interactivity for people to be able to change their settings. We have those on by default, and really think about embedding those in the design and steering the way the design should evolve, rather than our experience on previous projects was that they would be reviewed throughout the project without sign language and captions, and then added on at the end of the process. And I think this, for us, felt right. It was a great opportunity to be able to do it in this way. So yes, on for all.
So in terms of the RFID, yes, lots of user testing on site, and lots of rules put in place in terms of exactly at which point we need to be able to recognise visitors at various points within an interactive experience. and we included things like activity timeouts to make sure that if we knew that somebody definitely was no longer there, then we make sure we time out any passes that are recognised in the area. If somebody's not touching a screen, for example, we know that they're not engaging in something. And then we have to sort of find out where within the experiences we can have a little bit more flexibility on those kind of rules. So, for example, where somebody's engaged in video playback, for example. So we've got like an interactive database activity, touchscreen activity. We know that if they're on an informational screen and there's no touch there for, let's say, 45, 60 seconds, and it's a short block of text there, then there's a fair chance that person may have left. So we may start to count that person out there, so we don't get that overlap of signals being read, to make sure that when the next person arrives in front of that screen, that they are read accurately. However, if they are engaging in video playback and that video might be 45 to 60 seconds, then we ease off on those things, because we know that naturally there won't be any touches on screen at any given time there. So yeah, we sort of created sort of quite a complex web of rules really in terms of that RFID recognition. We do rely on things like the screen reader capability to make sure that people are able to understand which passes are being recognised at any given time, and then can select from a list of passes if multiple passes are recognised, for example, on a one-player activity. So yes, it's something that took quite a lot of testing on site. Took a lot of sort of all hands on deck to really sort of try and a lot of trial and error really with that one, because the RFID technology is so geography dependent really. We did lots and lots of trials and testing ahead of the installation on site, but ultimately there are lots of geographical environmental factors there that do start to affect that once you're on site. Not least the positioning of sort of metal frameworks around screens, things like that. Given the timings of when the museum opened, sort of midway through the summer this year, it meant that all of our testing and then the opening was done at a point when obviously the COVID-19 pandemic was at its height. So additional measures were put in place as well there. So things like transparent panels in between individual users on an interactive wall. Things like that all start to create slightly different, unusual circumstances in terms of how that RFID signal bounces around. So it's something that's been iterated throughout installation, and will continue to iterate as the museum continues really, and starts to find out on currently numbers are relatively restricted in terms of managing numbers gallery by gallery with COVID-19 in mind. As and when the numbers start to ramp up a little more, again, that will change things as well in terms of where that RFID read starts to cross over from screen to screen. So it's not an easy process, but by kind of tweaking things and continuing to iterate as we go, then I think we're getting to a stage where that does kind of have that seamless sort of magic experience that visitors need.
I'm glad we got you back, Dan, and we were able to hear all that you had to offer. Again, our apologies. We're not quite sure what is happening. We keep losing the captioner. And so we unfortunately are not providing real-time captioning now. My sincerest apologies for that to everyone. Dan and Hayley, unless you wanted to add something else, if you want to go on to the next part of your presentation, that would be great.
Sure. Okay. So we wanted to start off this next section. We will go into the detail quite quickly in terms of individual screen design, individual exhibit experience design. But we wanted to start off with just a bit of an overview really on how we kind of work through the process in terms of user testing, in terms of, we sort of mentioned the consultation, working with experts throughout the process. So I guess part of the challenge here was just sort of the geographic natural challenge of a big project like this, whereby obviously we're based over in the UK, museums in Colorado Springs, but the other partners for the projects as well are based in various locations across the US, from Seattle, San Francisco, over to North Carolina, Washington DC on the other side. So we really had to kind of be quite strategic about the points that we all came together. We had to be quite smart about what we would want to test when we were in that situation. Obviously, throughout the duration of this, the museum's been growing brick by brick. We've had to find other space in and around the location. There was some fantastic support from a local museum in the area, the Space Foundation in Colorado Springs. We were able to use some of their sort of space to be able to start to mock up some quite large exhibits, and we'll show some images and some video from user testing there. But we tried to kind of have a nice balance, really, whereby we could work out what we could do locally in terms of usability testing and in terms of working with a variety of groups to start to get a sense of where any screen design or experience design might start to cause problems, or where there might be something that we just hadn't sort of taken into account, or we had potentially sort of taken a wrong path. So that was really useful for us to be able to test our assumptions locally. So we worked with local school groups. So there's the picture here, bottom right. This is a local school group based relatively close to our offices in Manchester that we worked with throughout the project, which was really nice to work with a group of enthusiastic young people who were able to give really super honest feedback, which was really, really helpful for us and for our design team. There's nothing worse than a user testing session where we sort of enter and everybody says it's all great. We don't really learn anything from that. We'd much rather sort of take the old adage of sort of design as if we're right and then test as if we're wrong. And this bunch of kids in particular were the first to tell us where we were wrong, which is great. Very, very helpful to creating the best end result. We work with other sort of specialist groups locally as well. Again, sort of both to kind of consult with and ask a lot of questions. We found that everybody within the community was very, very generous with the time and very, very helpful. We couldn't really have got to this point without that help. And again, working with Jan and Anupa at the Institute for Human Centered Design, and Woody and other people sort of involved at various stages was very, very useful for us to kind of almost kind of works as a sounding board to get feedback at various stages, to say, not only these are the things that aren't quite right, but also where we had kind of made a set of decisions, we tested those assumptions, we felt that we were going along the right way, to have other people who are experts in this field to work with and to kind of give us the confidence that actually, yes, we're making the right kind of decisions, we are kind of pushing in the right areas to help to raise the bar. It was incredibly helpful for the team to really kind of gain confidence in the approach and to know that where, as with all projects, there are, you have to pick your battles, and there are certain areas where we've had to push harder than in other areas, and it was useful to know and to kind of get the confidence in terms of which areas we should really be pushing for. As part of that mix, we were really lucky to work with Team USA, both the Olympic and the Paralympic team. A lot of the team train in various locations across the US, but a large percentage of them train in Colorado Springs at the Olympic and Paralympic Training Center. And so we were able to work with a lot of people there who came along to a variety of sessions. Some came just to one session, others came throughout the duration of the project, which was really, really helpful. And I have to admit that we sort of started a process at the beginning of the project thinking we will work with that group largely in terms of sporting authenticity, to make sure where we're creating things that they are reflective of their world, that we're making all the right conscious decisions in terms of the detail, in terms of the gameplay and things like that. But we felt initially, certainly my initial assumption was that actually in terms of usability testing, that we would get kind of the feedback that we needed more so from the smaller groups that we would work with, more local groups and so on. Largely because by nature, the Paralympic team are elite athletes and are able to do incredible things regardless of disability. And we had a sense at the start of the project that might mean that they wouldn't necessarily then have that sort of broader vision of other people who weren't quite able to do everything that they could in the way that they could. And I say that having worked on quite a lot of sports projects in the past, and I say this with the utmost respect to people, sort of elite sportsmen and women who naturally, to get to where they have to have a very, very narrow focus, and have to concentrate every day on, in some cases, doing a small handful of things very, very well. If they're not focused on that every day, then they won't become the best in the world at what they do. But what we found with the Paralympic group that we worked with was actually, yes, they do that, but also I was amazed really at their almost everybody that we worked with, their ability to empathise with other people, to understand and be champions of their community, to think about other disabilities, not just necessarily, you know, for example, working with the blind or low vision athletes, they were able to consider what we were trying to achieve from a lot of other standpoints as well, and not just from a visitor perspective. I think they were able to look at things from a experience design perspective, and also from a business perspective as well. As a museum, you know, they're having to make pragmatic choices as they go. They are having to create experiences that allow large groups of people to go through the museum on a day-to-day basis, and not kind of start to have issues with throughput and things like that. And the group that we worked with were fantastic in terms of being able to understand those business needs as well as visitor needs, and really sort of empathize and get that sort of true mix into the decision making, which was fantastic to find as we went. And we were also able to co-design as well with people who are experts in the field. So I've sort of used one example here. There's a photo on screen here of a blind low vision shooter. Now this currently isn't a Paralympic sport, but it is due to be a trial sport in Tokyo when the games happen next year, with the idea that then that may go on to be part of the Paris Games. But what we found here is that there are a number of rifle shooters who are working with assistive technology in really quite a complex way, listening to a set of audio waves that would really locate exactly where their sight was facing as regards the target. And there was a lot of data being sort of going back and forth as they move. Obviously, the minutiae really as they move the gun around there. You know, it obviously takes such a steady hand to be sort of an elite athlete in that particular sport. And so it felt like a nice example to share really, where we were able to look at the technology that's used for elite athletes to enable them to participate in a sport like this, and to look at that and to think, well, actually, okay, what are the core elements of that? You know, what would the MVP, the minimum viable product of this particular approach be if we were then to apply that into a museum setting, so that anybody, regardless of who they might be, could approach the screen and could use that as an aid. So we created for a couple of the examples that we'll go through in a bit more detail shortly. There's an archery activity, for example, whereby we use a simplified version of the same technology that helps people to understand the relative position between the bow and the target on screen. And we actually created that in a way that that audio then plays out inclusively for everybody. We're able to do that by understanding, working, co-designing with the experts who use that every day, and understanding, okay, well, which bits of this data, this audio information is really sort of important for the absolute accuracy that you need in the Olympic and Paralympic Games, and which of the elements are actually the simpler end that we can actually use, and anybody can instantly pick up a piece of equipment and understand how that helps to get to in this instance hit the target. But we sort of used that concept of co-designing as often as we could, really, to make sure that we were working with all of these groups, with individuals, to make sure that we weren't kind of just going to them with, you know, here's our ideas, what do you think? But really, we were able to sit down and more have a conversation and say, here's what we'd like to achieve. In some cases, we would say, you know, this is kind of our starting point, or these are some of the parameters involved, but also work with them to understand, actually, what would you do in this situation? What, as a visitor, what would you find would be really useful for you? And we found that process to be really useful. It kind of takes away the idea that we're putting things on the table and making assumptions, and it gives the end user a bit more agency within the whole process. It's a useful design process that doesn't work for every project. It's something I've done in the past. In previous role for previous company, I made a lot of mobile and tablet apps for young children, and particularly preschoolers. Being able to sit down and sort of co-create app designs and game designs with 3 to 5 year olds, for example. You come up with a completely different set of rules and experiences than you would do, you know, if our design team in a studio sat down and tried to work on that in isolation. And we find that that design process, obviously there's lots of tools and things that we can use to get from A to B, but we found that the idea of co-designing as we go, particularly with experts as well as end users, really helps to diversify the input into that design and to make sure that end result is as robust and exciting as possible for all users. So I'm going to pass back to Hayley for the next slide. I think Hayley, you're just on mute.
Yeah, I was. You're right. I started going away with myself without muting. Yeah, so I think that as Dan summarised those user testing sessions and co-designing sessions really is what they were. And I think as part of those sessions, we endeavoured to check in on some key points of what we wanted to achieve in terms of design, and every step of the way really checked back in with these questions. We were talking earlier about various parties in the room and accountability and bringing us back to the focus of what it was that we wanted to achieve. And so what we've done here is just to list a few bullet points really to summarise some of those key considerations in our early design thinking and the iteration of design throughout the project. And then we'll talk in a bit more detail about each one as we go through. But I think just to summarise, I think in terms of, and we would take this approach to any project with a view to making interactivity accessible for all. One of the things that we will always bear in mind is that I'm sure most people, everyone does when they're designing interactives, is a consistent usability, a consistent interface, so that when visitors are coming to each screen or interactive equipment, they're not having to relearn how to navigate their way through it at every different experience. So Dan mentioned earlier, I think that one of the great challenges of this project was the large variety of screen size and format. And so one of the challenges was trying to find a consistency that works across all of those different formats and sizes. We then had the very important, the universal keypad control, and thinking about, in terms of the interactivity and the usability, how can we best put this technology to use so it's not becoming a hindrance, it's becoming something that's intuitive to use throughout. And again, every single experience isn't having to be used in a different way. So again, we've got that consistency. So things remain intuitive, and also thinking about the location of the keypads as well, so that users will know where to find that interactivity with the keypads. Another key consideration in the design process was thinking about sensory needs. So when a visitor enters the museum, they might have they might have a need for a lower sensory experience, and how can we achieve that natively within our design without resorting to versioning in essence, wherever possible? Where can we achieve and meet those sensory needs by default within the overall design, rather than creating a separate version? That's not to say that in some instances where we couldn't achieve that default for whatever reason, which we'll talk about a bit more further in the presentation, we would offer an alternative version that would be triggered seamlessly by the RFID. So, and then of course, another key consideration for blind and low vision visitors, if how can we enable navigation around the experience? How can we offer meaningful equivalent experiences through audio, as well as what is there visually on screen, the visual design. We spent a lot of time researching and garnering already existing knowledge on audio design, and I think, Dan, you found the sonification handbook, which became again a great point of reference. So again, it's taking that that knowledge and experience that's already out there, and looking at how we can implement that to create these meaningful experiences for everybody. And that also included thinking about visual considerations such as colour contrast, colour blindness. So making sure that the designs that we were developing and implementing wasn't a reliance on those kind of factors. So really bearing that in mind. Also in terms of deaf and hard of hearing visitors, how can we again create and deliver these rich, meaningful experiences for people who cannot hear the audio content? So again, it's about providing visual equivalent in terms of experience, and where we have cues, and we're talking about the archery exhibit where we have that audio feedback. Also providing the visual feedback, and making sure that that kind of feedback visually stands out and is intuitive to seek out on screen. And also just talking about the various formats and sizes of the screens, and the wonderful gallery design, and how everything was sort of built into the architecture, presented a challenge in terms of sight lines and reach for each of the screens. So, you know, making sure we had some wonderful configurations where we might have, and we'll see a visual later on, 4 55-inch screens stacked on top of each other, but thinking about where that interactivity needs to sit, thinking about the fact that it should be adjustable, so people can adjust where possible those interactive zones for a reach that's comfortable for them. And also thinking about sight lines. Everything that we are is on screen and needs to be on screen. Everyone should be able to see that content with ease from whatever height. So that was a consideration. And on the next slide, we've included just a couple of images. I won't go into too much detail here, but this is these two images here are just intended to demonstrate, I guess, two very different screen formats. So the top image shows us a portrait mounted touch screen. I think that one was 55-inch, I think. So again, what we're doing then, you can see in that image, we're looking at visitors at various heights, and testing really just in that initial wireframing whether those interactive areas are accessible for people who are seated, and how the information on screen, how visible that is. Likewise, the bottom image shows a large, half of a large 360-degree projection area. So within that image, there are various cube areas of content that have been mapped out, and that's where our content was sitting within that projection. And then you can see another area there that houses the sign language interpreter and the captions. And we have another slide on, if we go to the next screen, just to show how those wireframes then developed into actual design. So the image on this screen shows a large AV projection, and it demonstrates where the filmed content was housed, and the ASL interpreter, the filmed sign language, was composited with the captions alongside there. So really thinking about this is a more conventional delivery of sign language and captions, but really just thinking about how we can add a bit of that museum look and feel, house style, reflect the architecture of the environment and the layout of that. So looking at the image shows these geometric shards which reflect the design of the gallery. And again, in the wireframing there, checking visible height, checking that font size is readable for seated visitors. And again, wireframing was one thing, but user testing with projection tests too, and adjusting as we went through that process. The next slide shows, this is an early wireframe showing it was the layout design for an interactive, all about the Olympic and Paralympic torches used throughout the torch relays across the games. So the intention with this slide here is just to show how we started to look at the layout of content for each interactive screen and really look at these navigation tools and how we might place them consistently throughout. So on this slide, we've got a number of content boxes across the top of the screen that are scrollable, or you can navigate them with the universal keypad. Along the bottom of the screen, we have the navigational devices that will be familiar to a lot of people, and we try to tie in with already familiar platforms and software that people may have already experienced. So the usual navigation devices to take you back to the home, access your settings, and if you find you come to an interactive, Dan was describing before that there are, continue to be, and it's an ever evolving process and learning process, complexities with the RFID and making sure that the correct signals are read. We do have this backup measure across all of the interactive. This settings button is placed consistently in the same place throughout, so that users can access and activate various settings if they need them. So again, this is all navigation. You can navigate this with the universal screen reader, keypad rather, and the screen reader is on by default, navigating with the keypad. And each of those navigational buttons are read by the screen reader too. If we go on to the next slide, this just demonstrates for this particular interactive. We actually produced and installed a version of this interactive for the Olympic Museum in Lausanne. And this is an example of an interactive that was adapted and evolved for the US Olympic and Paralympic Museum from a content point of view to include the Paralympic torches, but also with these inclusive design features in place. So we had to really think about, and it was a really valuable learning experience for us actually, that when you're thinking about the layout of content and how it's navigated and how that works with a universal keypad, it really makes you start thinking about how can this content be best laid out. And we found that being able to scroll through or step through this content in a linear magazine way provided the most consistent, most intuitive method by which to deliver the content. The grab on this slide here shows there's a breadcrumb trail. I'm never sure if that's the correct term for it, but a breadcrumb trail at the bottom which shows where you are within the content. So as you scroll through, that marker will show you where you are in the available slides. And this is an example of where we thought we initially made the mistake of thinking it would be useful to categorize that progress throughout the interactive. So we had sections relating to the design of the torches, sections related to the torch relays, and then we had a trivia fun fact section. But actually, when we tested it with the keypad and the screen reader in the user testing sessions, it was confusing. So that was a design feature that was taken out as a result of those user testing sessions. Again, something we'd have never thought to consider without that valuable feedback. And this next slide just shows how the intention is to demonstrate here. There are 3 different interactives being shown on this slide. There is a interactive about strategy in gameplay, which is in gallery themes around training, and they're all presented by Paralympic and Olympic athletes, which we'll talk through in more detail shortly. The image to the right shows, I think they've gained the nickname for this interactive now. There are 4 Herculean totems, they call them, in the lobby, is how they're referred to now. And these are 4 totems that are made up of 4 stacked 55-inch screens. So this shows an example of an interactive where the interactive area by default is at the second screen up, which we, through testing, established would be the most usable area. But there is a handle at the bottom of that interactive area that allows you to pull that interactive area up and down to suit your height. And then at the bottom of screen on the left is another large-scale interactive. These were 4 55 portrait-mounted touch screens, one next to the other. Again, you can have, it's designed for 4 users to be using each of the screens, but with COVID, we deactivated 2 of those and had the Perspex panels just to create that distance. But again, translating that consistent user interface design to a portrait format. So obviously the look and feel and the style is very different to reflect the gallery design, but trying to maintain those navigational consistencies where possible. And then on to the next slide. This I'll hand over to Dan here, but this top one was an example. There's an image on this slide, the top image, which is an example of another large scale interactive that we produced for the Olympic Museum in Lausanne, which was updated, refreshed, and evolved for the Olympic and Paralympic Museum with new content, which I'll let Dan talk about in some more detail.
Yep, sure. Thanks, Hayley. So yeah, the main thing we really wanted to get across the museum as a whole really was that whoever you are, wherever you come from when you enter the museum, somebody like you will be looking back at you from a screen. That idea that Team USA, you know, literally tens of thousands of athletes have represented USA at the Olympics and Paralympics throughout the years with a huge amount of success. And we like the idea. It was always core to the museum's principles that whichever screen you're looking at, there will always be somebody involved in that presentation that you can relate to on one way or another. So we sort of pulled a few examples together just on this slide and a few subsequent slides. Hayley mentioned the Olympic and Paralympic timeline. So the idea here is you've got short films that tell the story of each individual set of games. We've got a short video sample to show on that slightly later on in the deck. So I won't go into that in too much detail. But I think one of the main things that differentiated this from the other locations that we've made this software for. So we made the software and the content in terms of the timeline for probably 5 or 6 other locations around the world as part of the Olympic Museum network that Hayley mentioned earlier on. So there's a version of this in Tokyo, there's a version in Oslo, version in Lausanne, etc. And the main difference here is that this was the first location where the museum team had said to us, actually, we need to pick these films apart and ensure that on every occasion we're telling the Paralympic story with just as much parity as the Olympic story. And it was really nice to be able to do that. We've been able to sort of add a little bit more of a Team USA flavour to these films as well. But they tend to tell the story around the games as much as anything about the changes politically, what's been happening in the world around the individual events. And so they're a great opportunity to help to further discourse. So for example, in other locations and in Colorado Springs, this is one of the primary locations for school groups where they will come in, they will watch, 1, 2 or 3 of these short films as trigger points for discussions about how the games sit as a center point to a lot of events that are happening around the world. So a great opportunity for us to make sure that we really had that great mix of faces and voices, and likewise with kind of other areas where we're either creating bespoke content or pulling together archive content for a number of different kinds of exhibits. That was always forefront of our mind, that we wanted to make sure that everybody was positively represented throughout. And we sort of got that in a bit more detail here with one particular example. So throughout the museum, it was always a core principle that the museum wanted to ensure that the stories were told by the athletes. These were their stories, and this had to be their voice. And so anywhere where you hear a voice within the museum, that will always be the voice of an athlete. So in a lot of cases, that includes narration by athletes on video presentations, but also in terms of the audio description, we worked with a small group of athletes to create those scripts and to record those scripts with those athletes. And it was really nice actually to get the opportunity to do that and to do that with a variety of different athletes. So the images on the right hand side of this slide show, working from the bottom upwards, Rowdy Gaines, a Olympic swimmer, who is his image there is accompanied by the logos of several sports broadcasters. He's very familiar behind the microphone, very comfortable in that space. Likewise, Kathy Johnson, gymnast from 1984. Worked with us on the audio description as well. It was fantastic to work with. Again, she's got lots of Olympic and Paralympic experience. Brad Snyder up at the top, slightly different in that Brad's sort of recently come to the end of his swimming career. Brad's a really interesting character. He was in the army and lost his vision on the front line, and a year from the date of that incident happening, he was in the pool in London 2012, winning a gold medal. He'd gone from one completely different lifestyle to having a huge life-changing event, to then within 12 months, literally to the day, winning a gold medal, which is a phenomenal story. Really great guy. He came on board to help with the audio description as well, and so the 3 voices are heard at various stages throughout the museum experience. Some of them, at every gallery, there's an introductory audio description where visitors are given a bit of orientation, a bit of editorial context for a gallery. They start to understand what is available and where those things are within the gallery. So there's a little bit of sort of wayfinding as part of it. But we also use the audio description on video pieces as well. There's quite a lot of video in the museum that is, I guess, out of the box, is silent video. It's just there for illustrative purposes. So that might be, for example, on the Hall of Fame totems that Hayley mentioned earlier. We have short 45-second maximum pieces of video there that allow you just to see, here's a little bit of color added to this piece where you can see, here's Carl Lewis, here's any number of other athletes. Here are the sort of 2, 3, 4, 5 moments that define their sporting career. So we worked with this team of athletes to voice the audio descriptions across those pieces. And with Brad, it was a really interesting process. Brad is an audio description user, so it felt really positive for us to be able to work with him for his voice to convey that then to help other people visiting the museum to understand the content there. Obviously, additional challenges to that as well, in that we tried to work with Brad. He's a native screen reader user and has been since he lost his vision. But we found the idea of using that screen reader particularly challenging from a production point of view. we were losing a lot of the nuance of the delivery really when Brad was sort of listening back to the synthetic voice and then sort of articulating that himself. So we ended up kind of going back and forth line by line with Brad, sort of feeding him the line, and then he would play that back. And the end result was fantastic, and it was great. It's a nice example really of where sort of that decision making from the core museum team of, you know, these are the people we want to work with, these are the voices that we want, it's important to tell their story. It would have been a lot easier to work more so with people like Rowdy and Kathy. Those recording sessions obviously would have been done in different ways, would have been a lot quicker for us, but we felt it's really important to share that view so that everybody got the chance, everyone's part of that process, everybody was able to be represented. It was the difficulty of all of those recording sessions were sort of really sort of double, tripled, and magnified even more by the fact that we recorded them all sort of just after the lockdown period really for COVID-19. So we had to send out Zoom recording kits to the athletes. They were fantastic, really helpful in terms of being able to find acoustically sound areas in their homes. Usually in the sort of walk-in wardrobe closet kind of area where the clothes in there sort of dampened the audio slightly. And of course, they were very lengthy sessions. It's a lot longer than it would be sort of sitting down in a studio and doing it that way. But obviously, we weren't able to do that for safety reasons. And so it's great that the Olympic and Paralympic athletes were able to give us their time so generously in that respect. The other thing we wanted to note here as well is that all the audio throughout the museum, there are options available for visitors essentially. So if visitors want to access something like a screen reader or an audio description, but want that to play out natively from the core speakers that are associated with individual screens, or just the speakers at the intro panels, for example, then that's available as an option. So as soon as they come to an intro area, there'll be a tactile floor marking to denote that this is the intro section, and from that position, the audio will automatically trigger and they'll hear Brad, Kathy, or Rowdy's voice explaining what's available within that gallery. But as well as that, the museum opted for an assistive listening system as well. So that if visitors do want to have sort of their own listening devices as well to boost that audio, then that's available as well. What we didn't want to do is to make that the only option. We were conscious that for visitors who require that service, it might be quite isolating if they're forced to go around with headphones on. But for other people, that might be the most comfortable way of doing it. So, the museum went with the Listen Everywhere assistive listening app. There are numbers available throughout the museum that indicate which channel to flick to, and they just stream in real time the audio that's coming from the main playback. We also thought it's worth kind of just talking a little bit about the ASL interpretation throughout. As Hayley said, this is, as you can see from this example, from a design perspective, the ASL interpreter is sort of built into the framework throughout. So the faces are familiar and sort of used throughout the museum. Again, similar to as I described with narration, the museum team were keen for us to explore whether we could use an athlete to be in position as the ASL interpreter. And what we found, sort of looking through, sort of researching quite extensively, working with Team USA to try and work out, would there be somebody available? It was one of the few areas where we had to push back to the museum team to say, actually, from our understanding, from consulting with experts, we'll be much better working with somebody who's established and does ASL interpretation day to day, who are experts in that field, and who are going to be able to give the best possible performance to interpret this content across all the screens. So we worked with so this is Louise, who's up on screen here, Louise Stern. Both Louise and Chris, who's our male ASL interpreter, are both natively deaf, both American ASL interpreters, but have communicated in that way throughout their life. Louise, for example, as we say in the slide there, she's fourth generation deaf on her father's side, and actually comes from a family with a lot of sporting heritage as well, which felt like a really nice, neat fit for the project. So yeah, I think all we wanted to include this really just kind of helps tell that story, really, that all kind of the casting, if you like, of everybody involved in the process, from the athletes on screen, to the voices that we hear, to the ASL interpreters. Everybody's been chosen to try and sort of piece together across the museum the right faces, the right diversity, to make sure that everybody is represented on screen. So we've got a few examples here. Conscious of time, I'll whittle through them relatively quickly, but I think as Hayley mentioned earlier, we've got an example here of the captions in ASL on screen, ensuring that everything is a usable height for everybody. But we can kind of go into actual more tangible examples here. So on the previous screen here, we sort of saw the initial wireframing. Here's just a little bit of an example of how the top image here shows sort of that patchwork quilt effect of lots of different images forming a storytelling experience. This is around the opening of the games, and we use a particular frame of that patchwork quilt for captions and another frame there for the ASL interpretation. Again, these images are from earlier in the project, so you can see that there's an example image of an ASL interpreter, for example, who isn't Louise or Chris, but kind of give you an idea of how we start to piece those together and make sure that the interpretation there is front and center. So here's a mock-up in the actual room, and so it's a 270-degree presentation, curved walls to the left and the right of the visitors as they enter the room. And we ensure that the ASL and the captions are in fixed positions and everything's kind of happening around them just to familiarize visitors, to make sure that they have a comfortable viewing experience. And likewise in this space for audio description, so you can't really see from this image, but there's a ramp that leads visitors into this space. To the right hand side of the ramp, there's a tactile floor strip there, which is the position that visitors can stand into for the audio described version of this presentation. So we've got there's multiple speakers in this space that sort of carry the music and the sound across the room, but we have a directional speaker just over in one side there that allows visitors who want to have the audio described version of the performance to engage in acting, consuming that in a way that doesn't necessarily well, it puts them in a safe position where this is a sort of a throughput area as well. Some people will skip this experience or walk directly through, so we have to be careful that we don't kind of put these positions where people will be stood to listen to the audio description in a position where there is visibility of the film, but they're in a position whereby it's a comfortable position to stand, that they're not going to be feeling like they're in somebody's way. The audio design can then work in a way that it doesn't overlap negatively with the other audio in the space and so on. So nice example of lots of different considerations, but an overall inclusive design there. One other thing we wanted to mention as well is that we did kind of work in terms of cognitive considerations to ensure that where possible, I guess for a sports museum, there's a certain acceptance and an ambition that you have to get across, that visceral nature of sport. There has to be a lot of movement. And at times that can create, I guess, intentionally a high sensory experience. And so we worked with the museum team to ensure that where there were particular examples, so this one that's on screen at the moment, this is a 30-foot screen that's in the lobby area of the museum as visitors enter, and there's a film based on Leroy Neiman's artwork that we created for that film, but it's huge. It takes so much space in the museum. It's really stunning, but again, we sort of use like paint splash effects and things like that within the presentation, and some movement of the athletes on screen that we know wouldn't work for everybody. So we've supplied the museum with a low sensory version of that, where we start to dial things down. We dial down both the audio as well as the visuals. And those low sensory versions are available on request for a few key exhibits across the museum where we all felt that pragmatically we couldn't do this everywhere, but in certain locations it would help the experience to be able to dial a few things back slightly. And that includes things like reducing some of the on-screen text, and in some cases minimizing some choice and things like that, just to pare down the experience where necessary. And again, working with local groups to look at where would the red flags be for certain people there, and where would there be other things that we may assume may be problematic, but actually most people in testing found was okay. Things like that we could leave in. And this is an example from the goal ball activity, where some of the simple things can be can be removed and easily sort of pared down when necessary. But I won't go into that one in too much detail because we've got a bit more info on that on a later slide. So I'll hand back to Hayley for a bit on content design.
So this, moving into the lab, the USOPM lab area, the intention with this gallery, the visitors been on a journey whereby they learn about the history of the ancient games to the modern day games. They get to hear from athletes and what motivates them and their stories. And from there, you go through the training gallery, which, as Dan said, we're going to show a few exhibits there in more detail. And then you come to this gallery area, and the intention here is to get across the innovation, the scientific and technological innovation that contributes toward enhancing or improving athletic performance, and the talents and the knowledge of the scientists, the coaches and the nutritionists, etc. And so we were presented with quite a design challenge in this area, in that with the technology that was to be used in this area, really wanted, the ambition was that the interactive technology being used would in itself give that feel of innovation, of something new, but at the same time needed to offer an intuitive and accessible experience for everybody. So this was a gallery area that I think would be true to say followed a separate schedule all of its own in terms of the prototyping and the user testing, and went through many iterations until we felt we'd really hit on something, with the collaboration of Creo and Gallagher and the museum and BBI to find a technology solution that would provide that meaningful experience for everyone. And it started out, the idea was that we'd have it started out, the idea with a HoloLens headset, there'd be a virtual reality experience of some kind. Then it went to, perhaps from there, to something that would be more accessible and inclusive, something along an augmented reality feel. And what we went for in the end was a transparent OLED screen, which allowed content to be displayed with the artifacts, with the objects behind, still visible behind these screens, so that the objects themselves are being showcased, and that the digital content isn't taken away from the visibility of those objects, and encouraging people to really look at them as they're viewing the content. You can see here, this was a user testing session looking at how that screen might work, and the designs, how they work with the objects behind them, but also how usable these would be in terms of interactivity. So coming up with a solution whereby visitors wouldn't necessarily need to touch the screen if they didn't want to, or they weren't comfortable doing so. There is gesture detection with these screens, so people can hover in front of the interactive selection to trigger content. Likewise, it was looking at a design that really pops on screen, but it was also a build-up of layers. Again, this is an early version, so we don't have final content. This image is showing an earlier version with placeholder content, but really showing here how we started to look at layering, so we could strip back those graphic embellishments, I guess you'd call them, these sort of grid, technical drawing style layers. Those could be pared back to offer something that would be more sensory friendly if required. So yeah, it really shows, gives you an example of how that was adapted. Here you can see a portrait screen. Again, it's the same technology solution in a different format. And in the image there, there's a mannequin with a speed suit that you can see through the transparent OLED screen with the content being brought up in front of it. And I think on the next slide, we have just a short video clip which demonstrates, actually, when you look at the video clip out of the context of the transparent screen, it looks quite sparse because those black areas are where the transparent areas are. But this is a particular example where we really scripted and sought out content for on-screen display that would almost, thinking back to this idea that we're designing inclusively and not adding layers of accessibility, how can we script content and deliver stories without needing to also script audio description? So essentially that everything that's being spoken with the narrative is covering what's on screen, and you're not missing out on a part of that experience by not being able to see the content on screen. So we'll play a short clip now, and hopefully that will come across, that idea of the narrative still being storytelling in its tone, but still offering that description of the on-screen content.
The track shoe evolution that led to Michael Johnson's gold trainer began more than a century before its 1996 debut. The earliest modern running shoes were standard leather shoes with nails hammered through the soles for grip. British cobbler J.W. Foster & Sons was the first manufacturer to design some of these early track shoes. On this side of the Atlantic, the U.S. Rubber Company produced its first rubber-soled shoes in 1892. Adidas later combined rubber and spikes, kickstarting a new generation of lighter track shoes. Jesse Owens wore them to shave a tenth of a second off the previous world record to win gold in the 100-meter at the Berlin 1936 Olympic Games. What does innovation sound like? Well, here are two beeps. The first is Owens' new world record, the second is the time that he beat. It wasn't only Adidas that was innovating. Fast forward to the late 1950s when Nike's founder Bill Bowerman started experimenting with shoe technology here in the US. Otis Davis was the first athlete to wear a Bowerman prototype to win gold in Rome 1960. Following Nike's successful development through the 60s, Bill designed the Nike Moon Shoe, which was inspired by a waffle iron where he was having breakfast with his wife. They were worn as the first official Nike shoes during competition by Mark Covert in the 1972 U.S. Olympic team trials. These early developments and gold medal performances led to the innovation and technology we've seen in recent history.
And then the next slide is from another exhibit. It's again, maybe I don't know if I'm conscious of time, just start the clip maybe part way through. Again, demonstrating how we updated the content for parity between the Olympics and the Paralympic Games, but also delivering a narrative that gives you the key messages of the brief essentially, and the content that's being displayed on the projection. If you want to say.
1968 was a year of people's protests. Worldwide, individuals took to the streets to demonstrate their opposition to the war in Vietnam, their dissatisfaction with the values of modern consumer society, and to demand fairer representation. From China to the United States, governments struggled to keep pace with the desire for change. U.S. long jumper Bob Beamon exceeded all expectations when he outjumped the automatic measuring equipment, winning gold and setting a world record that would last 23 years.
So yeah, that's just obviously a very short extract, but hopefully demonstrates that narrative approach we took with the voiceover there. So moving on to general use of the the touch screens, what we wanted to do here was just include a slide, again, that touches on the application of consistent patterns and rules for ease of use throughout, and really providing that consistent navigational usability. We provided these interfaces that allowed visitors to move up and down the different levels of data hierarchy, so that in almost all cases, as described in this slide, visitors could consistently access a menu and always get to the step that they wanted to get to in a simple, very quick, easy, keypad-friendly way. Again, so just really bearing in mind those universal keypads for the usability. And again, one thing that we found through user testing that we hadn't borne in mind early on in the project was the use of vertical menus to help facilitate this idea that content and the different levels of data should be accessible for people at different heights. Being able to adjust text sizes, contrast, activate or deactivate the screen reader, or with the universal keypad control. This settings feature is there as standard across all of the touchscreens, whatever the size or format throughout the museum. And the ASL and captions don't just feature within the larger format on-screen linear films that are played back. They're available for all video content featured within all of the interactives, in addition to audio descriptions, which again are automatically triggered for those that have set those preferences at RFID registration, either played out locally or via the headphones on the app that Dan described earlier. So on the next slide, I'll hand over to Dan.
Yeah, so this is, we just wanted to kind of show, we will wrap up shortly, so I know we need to leave time for questions, so we might not necessarily get through all of the slides that we'd hope to get through in the deck, but I'll finish on this section and then check in, see if we better pause there for Q&A at the end. So this was just to show one of the particular exhibits, which the experience there is that visitors get to come in, get to virtually meet an athlete. We shot lots and lots of Q&A with a couple of different athletes, and visitors get to approach that athlete and have a conversation. It's quite a unique experience. So we kind of just wanted to include a couple of these images here to show sort of the initial very early scoping of actually what might that look like. You know, how big does this virtual athlete need to be? What kind of technology might we need in place to enable this conversation to take place? How many people might use it at a time? Is it a group activity? Is it individuals? All those kind of conversations kind of take us from being in a room together with fabricators and software developers and other parties, start to look at that, start to put it together in terms of initial sketches and initial sort of ideation in terms of how we could deliver it from a technical point of view. And then eventually comes together into something like this. So you can see sort of centrally on the image, there's two rather large screens. They're sort of around 70 to 80 inches with 4K video there. We shot with Keegan Randall, Olympic 2018 gold medal winning cross country skier, 5-time Olympian, Matt Scott, Paralympian, 3-time Paralympian, I think, 2016 gold winner in Rio for wheelchair basketball. So visitors approach one of the screens, and we wanted to include this just an example of how sort of all of those parties come together and contribute to a great experience that is usable by anybody. So here you can see there's a pedestal in front of the screen. On that pedestal, there's a stool available for people to sit down, but also that stool can be removed. I think it sort of sits over to the side operationally, so that visitors using a wheelchair can operate the system as well. The athlete is pictured on the large screen, but on the pedestal there's also a small touch screen. That touchscreen is operable either by touch or by the universal keypad that we've mentioned a few times in this conversation. The idea of that touchscreen is that we give the visitors a bit of a call to action, how to use this thing, but we also have some prompts for visitors, give them a bit of information about the athletes and the kind of questions that they might want to ask about diet, training, winning, mentality, all these different things. We also allow visitors to type into that touchscreen, either via touch or by the hardware keyboard there. Tactile keyboard for, I guess we know that not everybody either would be able to or would like to talk into the microphone, but the microphone's there as well. Large tactile button there for us to hold down that triggers the microphone to be on to talk into the mic. So there's a lot of complexity there, not least in the software design and the huge web of data that we created to ensure that whatever questions asked, you get a relevant answer back. It was a real sort of labor of love to pull that together, but a really nice one where we've been able to sort of witness people using it, be really kind of blown away. They walk by the screen, their RFID is picked up in the location, and the athlete immediately sort of goes. There's a looping video on screen there where the athlete sort of starts looking down the lens of the camera. And as soon as they recognize somebody, they start to interact with them. Hey, come over here, ask me a question. But also what we thought was quite nice there was actually to use that as an opportunity for visitors to be onboarded really by the athlete. So for example, Matt Scott will say, hey, I'm Matt Scott, wheelchair basketballer. Why don't you come and ask me a question? Hold down the button, ask a question to the microphone, or you can use the touchscreen or the keypad to do the same thing essentially. He says it in a much more articulate way than I did then. But essentially, yeah, that we found in terms of sort of inclusive design and kind of coming away from the screen and pulling people in towards it. We've had to do a lot of this remotely over the past few months, obviously just naturally with everything that's happened this year. Legally, we've not been able to leave the country for some time. And so it's been really fascinating just to have a webcam set up in the corner of the room and for us to be able to sort of do a bit of distant user testing, really, where we can just see masses of people using exhibits like this. And for us to be tweaking things in the background with the developers, with the data set for an exhibit like this. We even changed some things in terms of the hardware positioning and in terms of how that RFID response is triggered, exactly which things we're triggering from the visits, from recognition of the visitor's RFID badge, so the athlete is able to communicate with them in a really smart way that makes the use of the interactive super intuitive. So that's one of the exhibits that we're sort of most proud of, I think, really, in this museum, and has gone down really well with visitors. It's really nice to be able to see sort of the top image there, a bunch of young people using it and sort of really have that wow moment. However they're interacting with that athlete, they have that sort of wow moment of, wow, this person seems to be speaking back to me in a way that's kind of it's not the synthetic voice of Alexa or Google Home. This is a real world athlete superstar, shot in 4K, answering any number of questions from, what's my favorite color to, what are my favorite snacks, to lots of serious questions of all kind of manner of things that visitors might ask around mental health, setting goals, career development, childhood, all sorts in there. So we do have some additional slides on the training gallery that we referred to a few times within this presentation, but conscious of time, we do want to make time for questions. So we won't go on to those slides now, but the article that Jan mentioned at the top of the session that we've contributed to, our chapter talks broadly about a lot of the stuff we discussed today, but does major on the training gallery there as well. So if we don't get a chance to go through that today, then that would be a good point of reference there to kind of dig in a little bit further around the training gallery and kind of how we made that inclusive for everybody. So Jan, did we want to pause the presentation at this stage for the final Q&A?
Well, we have about 3 minutes. So maybe instead of a Q&A, why don't you, Dan and Hayley, have some last words? And my question is to you, you have done such an extraordinary job here. How has this changed your approach to future projects? How will you carry this through to future projects that may or may not be directly connected to people with disabilities or people with a range of abilities?
I think one of the I think really one of the key things for me personally on the project is I think changed how our approach to storytelling, I think, in a remarkable way. I think it presented us with an opportunity to really rethink our methodology in terms of that design process and that idea of co-design and collaboration it's always been very much a part of our process, in that we will always very closely collaborate with the client team, the museum team. We will always look to use a test with the target audiences at key stages throughout development. But I think it's really that idea of co-design, and I think entering into the project with this idea that, yes, we've been making AV and interactive content for a long time, but actually coming at it with the mind of a beginner in terms of what there is to learn from, I think, from the existing knowledge that's already out there. You know, we referred very closely to the Smithsonian Guidelines report that's been produced, various other sources that we talked about earlier, and we talk more about that in the article. So I think it's really maximising the available knowledge, but also being, as I say, it's having that mind of a beginner in terms of what is the best way to deliver the experience for a particular brief. And I think for me personally, with learning, that it isn't the same answer every time. I think from between exhibit to exhibit, story to story within a single museum project, but across various other projects. And I think that's a very long-winded way of saying that I think that yes, we've taken these ideas and we've tested and we've run with them and hopefully added some more knowledge and experience into the mix. But I think for us, it's that idea that it's an ongoing process, and we see the museum open now, and it's, you know, seeing how these exhibits are being used and how they could be improved further with that further everyday user testing now the museum's open. So I think it's, yeah, very much not a closed project for us. It's an ongoing learning experience, and one we're enjoying very much. Very blessed to have been presented with the opportunity.
Dan, last words?
Yeah, I guess just to summarise quickly, conscious that we're slightly overrunning, so apologies for that. Yeah, I'd echo what Hayley said in terms of I think we can sort of use this project really positively to communicate with museums and with other experience providers for future projects, and kind of show that there's a lot of evidence here that if you get the right team in place and we make the right decisions throughout, and, you know, there's a lot of pragmatism involved in that, and a lot of questions being asked of one another. Where do we push? How do we push? But if we do all that, then it is genuinely noticed, and it will, in all cases, expand the possibilities of a museum, expand the potential visitor base. You know, if people have the time afterwards to look on TripAdvisor and look at the kind of reviews that are coming in for this museum, it's really positive to see that maybe every 6 or 7 reviews that somebody's mentioning the parity between Olympians and Paralympian. People are mentioning the inclusive design. People are mentioning all the kind of things that I think a lot of sort of budget holders might sort of in some cases assume that these things are in some cases legal requirements, in some cases they feel like the kind of things that they should do. You know, lots of reasons why people do these things, but I don't know that everybody necessarily understands that actually these things make a huge difference to people and really are noticed by the end user. So you know, hopefully we can sort of continue that story, continue to shout about this project and other future projects as well in the same light, so people understand actually this is what we should be doing. That, you know, there's no reason not to do this. You know, if a lot of times it comes down to budgets, and there are other areas where budgets can be pared back. We shouldn't be cutting back budgets to make things inclusive and accessible for everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Hayley and Dan, for your wonderful presentation today and your extraordinary work at the museum and what we know will become extraordinary models for future work for you and for, we hope, everyone else. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I hope you're all inspired to keep inclusive design at the forefront of everything you do in museums and life in general. Please note that we apologize again for the captioning problems that we had. So what we are going to do is post the recording of this program with captions next week on IHCD's website. And we ask that you keep checking back to make sure to get to it as soon as possible. And anyone else from the team who have last words? Valerie? Or anyone else? If not, I will say thank you for coming and we'll see you. Oops, there's Valerie.
Just very exciting indeed. So hopefully everyone else is inspired. I think there are a number of questions that would be nice if we could just provide an answer to people who RSVP'd today to some of those questions, because there's quite a few that we didn't get to. If we could offer that kindness, it would be nice.
Great. Thank you, everyone. See you next Lunch and Learn.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You.